Begin. Before we begin with this afternoon's session, I'd like to welcome Dr. Steve Farmer. Dr. Farmer is the CEO of the programs of the Western Pennsylvania School for the Deaf. They are our sponsor for CEASD's conference this year. Dr. Farmer? Hello, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. As Greg said, I am Dr. Farmer, Steve Farmer, the CEO of the programs of WPSD. Just wanted to say that we're a proud sponsor of CEASD, and we are so pleased and thankful for what CEASD is doing for schools and programs for the deaf all across the country. We are also accredited by CEASD and the Middle States Accrediting Association as well. I wanted to elaborate a little bit today on our programs. The programs of WPSD incorporate 5 sites. One is obviously in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is the Western Pennsylvania School for the Deaf. We have pre-kindergarten programs through post-high school programming. Next, we have the Scranton School for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Children, located in northeastern Pennsylvania. They have a preschool through 8th grade program there at that location. And then we have the Hershey preschool program, located in Hershey, Pennsylvania. We have about 15 or 20 students there. And then we have another program located in the Erie area, which is northwestern Pennsylvania. That is a preschool program in partnership with Edinburgh University, which has just established a Teacher of the Deaf program 2 or 3 years ago. It's a partnership with them, working with our deaf children there in our preschool program as they train their teachers of the deaf. We are pleased to just have received our very first intern at WPSD this year. And we expect a few more interns over the next few years through that partnership with Edinburgh University, who I must say are doing a wonderful job up there. And finally, we have an outreach program located in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, right where our state capital is. So we do a lot of outreach work through that office. We have about 365 students, all across the.
Hey, I got a FedEx according to my email.
Oh yeah, there's a bunch of
Okay.
We also have a
So I
parent
will bring my
infant
cart down
program.
after a little bit. I'm listening to a webinar.
Oh yeah, no
If
problem.
you can
All right,
mute your
thanks.
mics, please. I may be a little biased, but I think we're one of the best schools for the deaf in the entire world. I hope you enjoy this presentation, and we're glad to support this conference this year. I'll turn it back to Greg. This is Greg. I will spotlight myself. My recommendation for everyone who's a part of this meeting, since we have so many people on this call, we'll actually have 4 speakers for today's topic. I would suggest that you select to hide non-video participants. If they turn their cameras on, they would pop up on the screen as they turn them on. You can do that by clicking on View at the top right corner of your screen. And under the drop-down menu, you can click Hide Non-Video Speakers. Today's topic is a very good one: ASL and long-term academic performance of deaf children. We have 4 speakers today. The first is Dr. Naomi Caselli, an assistant professor in the Programs and Deaf Studies at the Wheelock College of Education and Human Development at Boston University. She is the PI on several NIH and NSF funded grants examining the vocabulary of ASL and how language deprivation affects how people learn and process ASL signs. She earned a joint PhD in psychology and cognitive science from Tufts University, as well as a master's in education, in deaf education, and a master's in psychology from Boston University. She is hearing and a native speaker of both ASL and English. Next, we have Dr. Wyatt Hall, who is a research assistant professor of obstetrics and gynecology, pediatrics, public health sciences, and neurology in the University of Rochester Medical Center. He is also a faculty fellow in the University of Rochester Office of Equity and Inclusion. He studies the relationship between early childhood language experiences and adult health outcomes, with the consideration of language acquisition as a social determinant of health, as especially exemplified by the phenomenon of language deprivation in the deaf population. Next is Dr. Michelle Burke, who is the principal of the Early Childhood Education Department at the California School for the Deaf in Fremont. Prior to this, Michelle was a student outcome specialist, where she coordinated assessment and data activities at CSD. Dr. Burke's doctoral dissertation compared the shared reading practices of deaf mothers with their preschool-aged deaf children with hearing mothers with the same aged hearing children. And then we have Erin Fenton, who is a doctoral student in the Boston University Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. She earned a master's in education from the University of Toronto and is a former lecturer of English to deaf students at the National Technical Institute for the Deaf. She studies language deprivation in adult populations and specifically looks at curricular development and bilingual grammar instruction and acquisition for deaf adolescents and adults. So welcome to all four of you. We're looking forward to your presentation today. You may begin your presentation. Can you share our presentation screen, please? Erin? Well, hello, everyone. My name is Michelle Burke. Thank you so much. It's for your nice introduction. And I welcome you all to this session. I work at California School for the Deaf in Fremont. And I am excited about this presentation today. And that's for a couple of reasons. Primarily, many of you know that the discussion about data and student outcomes, particularly, typically are reliant upon states who tell us how to assess students, how to consider the data, how sometimes our deaf and hard of hearing students are lumped together in one large category called students with disabilities. So this is an opportunity for us to showcase, if you will, how we can assess our own data and really focus on deaf and hard of hearing students. and their achievement. So I'm excited to be able to share that with you. The second reason that I'm thrilled is because this is truly a partnership between K-12 programs and universities, specifically being researchers. So often at Schools for the Deaf, we do not have the time nor the opportunity to really take a deep dive into the data that we're gathering on our students. But today we have an opportunity to have the support we need to take a deep dive in this and share and see what the possibilities are for all of us in the future. With that said, I'd like to introduce Aaron to proceed with the presentation. Hello, I'm a PhD student at Boston University. My name is Aaron, and I wanted to open today beginning to speak about language deprivation and early language acquisition. We've debated the definition of that term greatly. So we wanted to give our definition for the purposes of our meetings. Reduced access to both spoken and signed language, particularly during early childhood, that measurably impairs acquisition and proficiency in whatever languages that the child is exposed to, and or impairs development in other domains that depend on language acquisition and fluency. So we want to emphasize this isn't just a communication issue, but also it has greater impacts on any other sort of development that the child faces. It's not necessarily about one modality, whether it's signed or spoken language, but the concern is a lack of access to either. If there is access to neither one of them, that's a huge issue because we envision that as the biggest problem that deaf children are facing. We know that language deprivation, interpreter, is a large issue. It's an environmental issue. It's not biological. It's not about hearing per se, but what happens in the environment and access to language, which means we also have to consider how we know an educational environment is effective or successful and how we measure that success. There's a lot of research that has to do with early and short-term outcomes of early intervention, such as can children speak well, hear well, sign well, etc. There are a variety of outcomes that early intervention focuses on, but it's also important to look at the long-term outcomes for the future, not just when they're young children, but their long-term outcomes and what that looks like. So for this study, we've chosen to look at academic achievement as a measure of an effective educational environment. There are many other things that we can look at, the quality of life, earning ability, etc. In this study, we choose to focus on academic success or academic outcomes. We know that there's a lot of research out there. You can see all of this lit that shows a variety of modalities for different educational philosophies, educational programming, different types of school environments, subject areas, be that math, science, reading, writing, all of them. Regardless, we know that schools cannot effectively plan for all deaf and hard of hearing children for academic success. However, we also know that for any sort of child, any early exposure to language will prevent and improve academic achievement. We don't have a whole lot of research about what types of learning environments are successful for all children. There is no magic silver bullet, if you will. Nonetheless, we know that early acquisition of sign language and higher level signing skills are strongly correlated with stronger reading and mathematics skills for deaf and hard of hearing children and adults who use sign language. We know ASL does support academic development, particularly among those children who have deaf parents who sign. So for children with deaf parents, they account for about 5% of deaf children. So the rest of the 95% children, we want to be able to look at what their academic success looks like in conjunction with ASL. I'll give you some time to read this slide. So I was just mentioning this. We know ASL can be beneficial, but for deaf children with hearing families, a lot of folks suspect that they're facing a bigger issue. Many people say, for example, these quotes here, the first one, the majority of hearing parents typically lack proficiency in ASL and therefore cannot provide a language-rich environment for their deaf children in sign language. Many hearing families focus on spoken language because they're not fluent in sign language. Also, most hearing parents who do not know sign language, acquiring proficiency is a long and arduous process for them. But there's new evidence published in 2021, just this year, that it's unimportant whether parents are deaf or hearing, as long as there is early exposure to language in ASL. And that can also have age expectation vocabulary for the children. On this chart, it shows the growth curves, if you will, comparing deaf children with deaf parents. And each of these gray dots that you see here signifies a deaf child with hearing parents who were exposed to ASL before they were 6 months of age. So each of these dots, the children with hearing parents, are on par, vocabulary speaking of their vocabulary, with the deaf children who have deaf parents. So if they have early exposure, whether their parents are hearing or deaf, they have the same level of vocabulary usage, which is truly exciting news. But that's for 6-month-olds. We also want to look at long-term outcomes, which is what this study focuses on, long-term outcomes. So our questions are, can deaf and hard of hearing children with hearing parents have age-expected academic outcomes if they entered into a signing program early? And secondly, does ASL fluency predict academic outcomes among these children? So if they have stronger ASL skills, will they have stronger academic achievement? I'll go back to Michelle to talk about the environment, CSD's environment.
Thank you so much, Aaron. At TCSD, we are a bilingual school teaching ASL and in English. We also have students who are general education as well as special education classes. So we do have students that are using the Common Core and general education curriculum. We also have students that are using Access alternative curriculum. We have an early start program for infants where we have home-based services doing home visits from birth to 3 years old. We have another program for 18 months old to 3 years old, and that's center-based. We do also have a typical preschool program, which then follows students through high school, and our transition program as well. Over the last 10 years, we've been tracking our data. we've been looking at the school choice assessment. We're using something called the Measures of Academic Progress, or MAP testing. I'll talk a little bit more about that assessment in a moment. As we've been tracking this data, we were then able to look at 4 years worth. We looked at students who were deaf and hard of hearing and also had deaf or hard of hearing parents. There were about 200 of those students. We also had a group of students who were entering CEASD before they were 3 years old. Those would be students coming through our Early Start program. And then the majority of our students entered later, meaning after that age. That would have been after 3 years old. And what's probably a more common trend nationally is to see programs where the majority of the students, like ours, are entering later, including middle school and high school age. So you see here that our N number is small, but robust. You can see that for the students that are entering before the age of 3. One of the wonderful things about CEASD is that it really reflects the population in the state of California itself. We have representative diversity. I also mentioned that we do serve infants through high school. And we also have both commuter students, our day students, as well as a residential component to our program. Some of our students' families live 4 or 5 or more hours away. So those students do come and stay with us during the week and then go home on weekends. Now I'd like to go back and talk more about the MAP testing, the Measures of Academic Progress. This is an assessment out of the Northwest Evaluation Association. CEASD chose this assessment because it's actually an adaptive test. This means that it doesn't mean that only 4th graders have to take the 4th grade level of the assessment. And that is one of our challenges for some of the state mandates for assessment. This is a real opportunity to track student growth. We give the assessment twice a year, in the fall and in the spring. We use this data to help when we're writing the IEP goals. We also give the assessment covering 4 content areas: math, reading, language, and science. One of the things about MAP testing is it is an English-based assessment. I've had conversations with the group who administers MAP testing to have it translated or made available in ASL. That is still a work in progress. So that's the overview of the MAP assessment. And now we can talk a little bit more specifically about what that looks like. This is Erin. So that information from CEASD. We also worked with Boston University and the University of Rochester and had that 4 years worth of data. That's a pretty large amount of data to capture for those students. So that was a lot for us to be able to look at and assess. In analyzing the data, we looked at each of the groups separately. We looked at math, science, reading, and writing. We also wanted to look at any correlation to see if there were students with deaf parents, students that had early access to a deaf school, and students who had later access to a deaf school, to see if that was evident in student growth across those 3 groups. The first graph, which I'll talk a little bit about, you can see it here with the dots and the lines. So I will talk first about this and then show you more of the graphs with different groups of students. In this example, we're looking at math scores. This is a reference sample, which means it's the children with deaf parents. Each of the dots in this graph is one deaf child. There are 3 lines which are showing the averages for the group going horizontally. This is tracking math scores on the left side, and then the grade level at the bottom, from 4th through 12th grade. It was also mentioned that the MAP assessment itself is grade independent, which means this doesn't have to be given on the 4th grade level assessment to a 4th grade student. The student can continue to take the assessment until they max out. We're basing this on the kind of expected growth we want to see over time. So you see 4th grade and then an increase towards 6th grade, 8th grade, 10th grade. The older they get, we're seeing that progress. That's what we expect to see. I'm adding on to this now a second group, which you can see on the right side of the slide. Students in this one were children who entered CEASD before the age of 3. On the left side, with the red graph, that is also visible overlaid on the right side of the graph, so you can see the comparison. Red is deaf students. So we now have red and dark blue to see the comparison between the 2 groups. Those who have deaf parents and those who have hearing parents, but who entered the deaf school early. You can now see that there is a trend there. There is no significant difference between the students who have deaf parents and those who have hearing parents, but entered the deaf school early. There is no difference in their academic outcomes. This is the short term, but we don't have any comparison in this group of comparison students. We see that there is no immediate difference. They're still on track with their peers. And this is because these students had access from birth. Now I'm adding a third chart. You can see in this graph that we're adding students who entered CEASD after the age of 3. Now you can see the difference between the middle chart and the chart on the right. There's a few things I'd like to mention about this one and some of the variability. If you look at the third chart, there are light blue dots. So we do see that some students are on track with their peers who have deaf families or who were part of CEASD and enrolled before the age of 3. The average is below, but there are some students who are performing above or below in this sample. This is now the same chart I just showed you across all 4 of the content areas that are assessed. The first 3 at the top are math, and then going down the page, there are 3 charts for reading, 3 for writing, and 3 for science. We see the same trend for all subject areas. As you can see in the middle, for those 4 graphs, that students who are enrolled at CEASD before the age of 3 are on track with their peer group who have deaf families. We also see that in all subject areas, students who are enrolled after the age of 3 generally perform below the students in the other groups. We do also see a lot of variability among those students. What this shows, what is important for us to note, is that students with deaf parents, if their parents sign or not at home, is less important than if the child has access to deaf education early. If they were in a deaf school, then that impacts their long-term outcomes and improves those chances for those students. We also see here that students who entered a signing program later, in this case after the age of 3, that sometimes they're performing at an average, the same performance level or above, but generally below the performance that we see for students in the other two charts. Something else that's important to talk about as we're looking at this data is that ASL scores were positively related with academic outcomes. This means that if they had stronger ASL skills, more proficiency there, they had stronger academic performance. If they had more ASL, they had better math, better reading, writing, and science scores. So overall, they had higher academic outcomes. Our two research questions are seen here. Can deaf and hard of hearing children with hearing parents have age-expected academic outcomes when they enter a signing program early? The answer is yes. Also, does ASL fluency predict academic achievement among these children with hearing parents? The answer to that is also yes. So this is counter to a lot of concerns for people who say, no, you should be using sign language with your deaf or hard of hearing child. You need to make sure that you're considering language deprivation and the environment. What it's saying is that you can reliably look at early access to language to determine outcomes if they're enrolled in a signing program younger. So what does this mean? First of all, we do see that ASL proficiency is strongly related to academic outcomes, and also that parent ASL skills and the family does not have as much of an impact over the academic success of their child. Whether their parent is deaf or hearing, that's less significant than whether the child entered early. As long as the child enters a signing program early, then they can maintain academic performance with their peers. This also raises several other questions. So are the results specific to this school, or can they be generalized to other programs? I'd like to ask one of our other presenters to come on screen now and share information about how this can be translated to other schools. We're not sure if it's related, if this would apply to other schools or not, but there is data that we're looking at for different schools. Also, we're wondering if this is something that could inform parents that are making decisions about placement for their child before the age of 3. We're wondering if this, for example, if they have more ready access to resources, or if they're already in supportive ASL programs. And also, if the success of the program has to do with early intervention or the experiences they have during school. We still have a lot of questions and more data and more information about other programs, which will help us to answer some of these questions. If this is specific to CEASD or if it can be generalized to other programs. There are a few issues with this study. Standardized tests themselves are problematic. This was already mentioned, that the test itself is given in English. There's not an ASL version. So we're testing for outcomes, but we're not getting the same information about ASL outcomes for those students. Also, standardized tests are often not considered to be a good fit for students of color. And the students in our sample study, there were a much more representative, diverse group, and including students of color. But this is designed for students who have English as their first language. It's not designed for students who have English as their second language. That means that it may not be accurately measuring students like the deaf students that we serve.
We need more research in order to find out these academic outcomes and achievement for these students. So our landing point is that it's not true that hearing parents cannot provide a language-rich environment, that that a deaf program or a signing program is not accurate or appropriate. We know from the data, it shows the children with hearing parents, deaf children with hearing parents, can see grade level academic achievement given early entry into a bilingual program. And now I'll turn it over to Naomi Caselli to talk about how we use this sort of data for advocacy. Thank you very much, Erin. So yes, thinking about, as Michelle said in her opening discussion, how we can partner in order to use this data to answer your questions, to design ways that are most beneficial, rather than relying on state agencies or other organizations in order to interpret the data for us. And I think there are many ways that we can use the data. We can tell stories. And this collaboration is truly an inspiring partnership for me. And especially as we consider how we can use these numbers in order to advocate for what we are already seeing in our schools. So with the partnership with CEASD, we have done webinars. We plan to submit data to the general public for sharing. We'll be creating some infographics based on the data that's been presented today in order to distribute that and for use in advocacy, for conversations with families, helping them understand the environment, and also be able to frame the data in ways that they feel are most beneficial. So we're offering to partner with anyone who is interested to include this sort of study, or to use in order to help analyze your data. I know many of you are gathering the data already. If we can be of assistance to summarize this data and look through it, we are more than happy to do so. I'm happy to talk about exactly how that would benefit you. That's our offer today. And I think that is our last slide. Well, thank you everyone for inviting us and for listening to this presentation. We're really looking forward to a rich discussion about what we're going to do next and your thoughts and comments. Yes, I should also say this study includes several of us. So we'll have everyone who's partnered on this project come on up and answer questions. This is Aaron speaking. I'm looking at the chat box right now, and someone has asked if the third group is after the age of 3, if it's any age after 3, and the answer is yes. After 3 means could mean 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, etc. So they entered the program at any age, but not before the age of 3. This is Wyatt speaking. One thing to emphasize about the 3-year-olds in this study, we have quote unquote chosen the age of 3. That was kind of an arbitrary age to pick, but 3 makes sense for a number of reasons. The age of 3 is when the transition is made from early education into the educational system. So 3 years of age made sense for us almost naturally because of the transition into school. Also, 3 years was the age where we saw that trend begin to take place. The deaf of deaf and deaf of hearing trend converged in that age. And so there was no statistical difference. When you get into the ages of 4 and 5, you start to see a diverging of the reference group versus the group we were studying. So we picked the age of 3 for that reason. And we of course have more data to look at, but we're wondering if 3 is a vital age that has impacts that last through their whole school career and past the age of 18. So that's a little bit of information about the environment. Naomi, one thing to add. Yes, so 3 isn't a magic number. It's not like, as long as it's before 3, you're great. If it's after 3, oh well, this is going to be a horrible thing. No, we're seeing kids who even have come in very late meet the average score or even come in above average. So it's not like there's something magical about the age of 3. We want to caution everyone. It's not like, once you're over 3 years of age, it's too late. We can't do anything. That is not what the data is reflecting. The second comment that I'm seeing, there's another question saying, do we have norms-based national map data that could be used by 20 plus deaf schools? I think my answer to that would be, I think we need to create our own. We intentionally chose not to use the national map data norms because the norms are based on generally monolingual children who access the test in their first or native language. The kids in this sample and many deaf children are going to be accessing this test through their secondary language, and they are bilingual. So, and there's a lot of data that says it is not a good idea ever to compare bilingual children to monolingual children. So what we've done here was to create our own norms, and we can do that individually for every school. Figure out those statistics of the norms for that particular environment and start to make comparisons there instead of simply relying upon the national norms. Now, if there were more schools for the deaf involved, we could certainly create something a little more permanent that folks could use. But I think it's worth creating norms, establishing norms for now, newly every time for every study rather than depending on outside sources. So Michelle Burke, to follow up with that on the chat, NWEA did establish a set of norms around 8 to 10 years ago. I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact time, how long ago that was, but it was only deaf and hard of hearing students who've taken these tests, this assessment rather. The challenge with that is multifaceted. Number one, it doesn't include all deaf and hard of hearing students who've taken the test all over the US. There might be some in public schools who were not included in the data. Secondly, the point of gathering the data and establishing norms on that data is not to compare deaf and hard of hearing programs. We want to make sure that the point is in order to help all of us continue to grow and how we're working together to see what is successful in schools and programs, draw on that knowledge and use it in our own programs to the advantage of the children. So I want to clarify, it wasn't, oh, I'm such a great school and they're not. That's not what it's about. So NWEA was a little hesitant about that, and they were cautioned about establishing those norms. They did it one time, and it was just a snapshot. It was not a longitudinal view in any way, shape, or form. So when Naomi mentioned that, it's better for us to kind of own the data, so to speak, because we know what the student population looks like. And thus we have a better way of measuring and understanding the variability within our student population. And so while we are working with an NWEA, I think there's a lot of benefit to working internally because we better understand our own students. Naomi's speaking. There's a chat message in the chat box saying that the work is ongoing, trying to think about how to collect data and how to share that data, compile and share the data. I'm aware of that, and I think that's a wonderful endeavor. But I think there are a couple ways of approaching this, and really both could happen. Seemingly, there's interest in creating some sort of permanent clearinghouse or database where updated information, updated data is shared in more of a live environment. That would help us as we look at how COVID or coronavirus has impacted education. We can also look back and look at a more lengthy time period. I think the other possibility to think about is smaller data sets that are not live, that don't require the level of complexity that a live database would require. That means we would just observe your data, and both are possible and beneficial. I think it's worth considering both the short-term data sets and the long-term data sets and how we use that data. This is Wyatt. Shannon in the comments has a question. I think Naomi, Aaron, it might be better for you. Help them understand how the norms are established, whether you're using growth percentiles or grades. Explain that, please. Aaron, you want me to talk about that? Oh, this is Aaron. We chose to use the MAP scores because, again, the test is grade independent, meaning, we see that growth over time through tracking those scores. And this is Naomi. The growth, the map offers the growth and the scores, the growth percentage and the scores. The way that we've reflected it, we've shown it through growth by age. We've broken it down by age. So we're using raw numbers, so to speak, but you can see the growth trend rather than looking at growth percentiles or percentages. I'm happy to explain that more in depth if they're interested, but some of it is just the same information. It's just reflected in a different way. And there's also, Kelly is asking a question about the trend. Aaron, do you want to explain that? Yeah, I didn't add it in the presentation, but the middle line of the trend is the average. They're one standard deviation above the ones in the first line and one standard deviation below in the third line. So the middle line would be the average, separated by standard deviations. This is Naomi. So that shows the average of the range of growth. The red is the whole graph is based on deaf kids with deaf parents. That's what we're considering our norm group. That's the information from CSD. So we're comparing them to deaf children of deaf parents, and then the blues are deaf children with hearing parents, if that makes sense. And this is Wyatt. I think if you can envision, the chart has each individual student's score represented by dots. So there are a bunch of dots, and then the lines represent the average for the middle range, the high range, really well-performing students, and then the lower range as well. It's just a visual representation thereof. Yes. And this is Naomi. I don't know if people want to ask questions not through the chat. They feel free, and raise your hand, and we can spotlight your camera. Michelle? Tony is asking, this is Michelle, about students who come from families where their home language is Spanish. Yes, it's a challenge and a complexity. And a lot of that depends upon the student's access to their home language or the language used in their home. We often find that students do not have access to the language spoken in their home, regardless of whether that's Chinese, Spanish, Hindu, Urdu. There are so many languages represented. We have I think, over 20 different languages represented within the body of CSD. So it is typical that students will arrive with, I'm sorry, I should say without a complete comprehension of language, whether that be the language spoken in their home, English, or ASL. Nor ASL, excuse the interpreter. So we face that challenge. For those who arrive with language, there may be gaps or deprivation present. We provide first ASL immersion, first and foremost, in order to facilitate that language acquisition. We cannot expect our students to learn academically through ASL if they do not have a foundation of ASL on which to build. This is why I'll add just a quick thought. In this project, the collaboration of Fremont with Boston University, I grew up in a mainstream school. I didn't go to a school for the deaf. I really didn't comprehend that world as I was growing up. And to be completely honest, I had no idea that the larger populations of students in deaf schools arrived there late. I knew that often, we'd see some students transition from the mainstream school because they were lagging. But in this environment, when I see this number, it's growing. The largest group at Fremont, and I assume at other schools for the deaf, are entering late, so to speak. And my takeaway from this is, again, this is my personal view. We need to reflect that. We need to show what's going on with that, why deaf schools are being used to try and catch up students, so to speak, when they're lagging in a mainstream school. Why are students allowed to lag that far in the mainstream school, period, until they're into middle school and high school, and then they're finally transitioned to a school for the deaf? So that wasn't necessarily a goal, an outcome that we looked for, but personally, I was never aware of that until this study. And that became very evident to me. And that's part of my passion with this program, and talking with Michelle about this project, is I really want to foster an awareness among deaf schools to think about what the data is that they have and what stories they can use in order to show that deaf schools shouldn't be used to just try to catch up, or, if you will, fix a student later. We need to foster those early conversations, providing ASL exposure early on, and in general. So that's a personal reflection that I take away from that. And now that I know that, I'll emphasize that myself as I speak with folks, so that they can get an understanding of what's happening across the education landscape. Michelle? I see a lot of amens in the chat box. Those of us in the K-12 programming world, these are the same old stories, unfortunately. But we're also saying that the beauty of arriving to a school for the deaf is, even though we may not see the sort of growth that we want and would love to see for every student, by the time they graduate, we do see that regardless of the foundation that they've had, when they come to the deaf school, they take progress with them after graduation. So when we have alumni come, we're often impressed at their growth and to see their social emotional skills. And we see that growth. Then that's progress that's not necessarily documented. So it's a missed opportunity, a lost opportunity, to show really that students continue to thrive even after they leave our halls. And again, once they receive that ASL foundation, once they're given that.
This is Naomi. So in sharing what I think research can do, I would say this study is not a surprise for most of you. this is things you already know. These are results that you would expect to see. These patterns are things you already experience all the time. My hope is that by bringing this to you, with the statistics and the numbers demonstrated here, the knowledge that's shown through that we could reinforce what you are already seeing and support you in the patterns you already see. And I don't think there's anything we could say today that would surprise most of you. Our job as researchers, the way I see it, is you already know better than we do. But what you do know, how can we have numbers to make available to you as a resource, as materials that would support you in what you're fighting for what you need? This is why I wanted to go back to a point talking about data. That data on its own, for lack of a better word, is neutral. Data just is. It is numbers. It is charts until you use it. Data is there to be interpreted, to be applied. And that is why we encourage you so strongly to take this data, to interpret it. That if it fits your experience, the analysis of this data could easily be taken to say, look at schools for the deaf and how they have delays in their students, look at their numbers at graduation. The same data could be seen from different lenses, interpreted different ways. But that's where you all come in. If you have access to this data, as you're analyzing it, as you're working with us or other collaborators, what framework are you using? Through what frame are you describing the data and what you see, the narrative about the data itself, so that you're controlling that conversation, so that you're sharing it with other people with that information that you want it to be seen. That yes, the data on its own is neutral. We have deaf researchers, CODA researchers, so we have our influence in how we're interpreting the data. Others could interpret it differently, but this is what we're seeing in the community. It's what you're seeing. So we really want to encourage you to take these numbers, take this data, and share it in a way that can have a positive impact in the work you do. Tony.
Hello, everyone. It's great to see you all. It's snowing in Rochester, if you're unaware.
That's true.
But really, I struggle as a superintendent, and I have struggled over the years. There are many students who arrive late, and they typically do that because of state standardized testing. It's 3rd through 8th grade is when that's required. They wait until they fail, and then they send them to the deaf schools to fix it, so to speak. And we recognize that they come in with a delay. My other challenge is I know that researchers and future researchers, students know that we know that students who arrive early, they do very well, they're at grade level, and then parents decide to place them in a mainstream school. And they lose the bilingual approach. It becomes a monolingual environment for that student. Not only hearing parents, but deaf parents have done this as well. They would just go ahead and put them in a quote unquote normal school while we're viewed as an abnormal or not normal school. Can we look at the data on the growth continuity of if we have students that stay? Because sometimes we lose students and then they come back and they are regressing. They've regressed from their peers from 3 or 4 years ago, because it's been a period of 3 or 4 years. And of course, the deaf schools gets blamed. So maybe that's something we can assess in the long run, whether they arrive early and if they stay in the bilingual approach in their academic career. I think that's an important part of the research going forward. So I submit that for your thoughts.
White's saying good point. Naomi's saying yes. If we have enough kids like that who leave and return to the school, and we have the data to track it, then that is a way you could show this is the same kid leaving and coming back. Yes, this is what we're seeing. So we want to look at those kinds of questions. When the student comes back, where are they? Are they at grade level? Where are they in relation to their peers? And yes, where were they when they started, when they left? Thank you. That's such a good point.
Great job. Thank you.
Related to what Naomi was just saying, this is Erin. The data, yes, it's showing what we already see. If we have enough data as researchers, we need to have enough so that we can analyze it, but we know that this is things you are already aware of in your work. This is Michelle. That's why we need larger numbers. We need a larger N. We need more people involved in our research so that we can count how many left and came back, how many are in that group. We don't have that right here, but our N is so small that we didn't have enough data to do that level of analysis. We would love to have a more global set of data so that we could have a larger N to work with and have more robust ability to analyze and more robust statistics that be more reliable and valid. Please, with your question.
I'm from CSD as well. I'm very proud of our school, but for those, that are responsible not only for the program during the day, the data, here at the school, we use ASL, but we also have social opportunities and social experiences. That could be in the form of athletics and all these other things that bolster the academic prowess of our students. What Fremont has is a critical mass of students. Those that are thriving not only within class, but outside of class. I think it's important that we notice that when these students are taken away from that, they lose that opportunity to continue to thrive and grow in their linguistic prowess.
Amy saying yes, definitely. But we're thinking about what the exact magic is. Kids are doing great, but why? What is contributing to that success? Is it because of the environment? What is the environment? There's so many advantages to the environment that the school itself, the whole full picture of what it means to be in that kind of educational placement, really needing to analyze and look at that. And I think that's something that we're not able to fully answer what contributes to that success, but what is CSD doing that other schools can imitate, can implement to know what things are working or not? And yeah, it's absolutely, you're right, it's important. We definitely don't want to give a message that 3 years old, that is it. There's nothing else that needs to be factored in terms of home life and school life. And of course, there's a whole lot more going on.
Yeah, those that arrive at the early age of 3 tend to be at grade level or above. Not always, of course. And others that come in late, some in spite, such as myself, in spite of that fact, in spite of lower expectations, some just naturally achieve, just as they would in the mainstream program. But I think when you're speaking generally, most probably do not graduate at grade level. But as Michelle was mentioning, they continue to grow and thrive after that because they have a foundation, and life continues the growth trend. But the important thing is to make sure that they have a good foundation before they graduate. I wish everyone would enter at the age of 3. In reality, that's not possible. And some deaf children or deaf parents still look at a deaf school as not a wonderful option for them. Depending on the school, or maybe it's just the perspective. It really is irrelevant. They might say, well, you're a deaf child, but you sign really well, so we'll put you in a mainstream school. But the data says, well, hold on, let's look at this a little deeper. Okay.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. This is why. So there was a question from Jason in terms of an alternative assessment, and if there's a way to disaggregate the data to look at the students who are taking the alternative assessment. Yes, this is Michelle. I did respond in the chat that yes, our students who are accessing the alternative curriculum, which we refer to as AC, the alternative curriculum, the alternative map testing, because it's about growth and not grade level, we do use the data to help teachers with their instruction planning, also to help as we're writing and designing IEP goals. We don't use that for the same assessment of student data. if we're looking at general education students and then looking at students who are taking the alternative assessment separately, we wanted to be able to keep the number as big as we could and not have such small variables, but yes, that is a possibility. This is Naomi. I'm seeing Claire in the chat, I think responding to the comment about what's the magic? What makes it as someone successful? And we know what it is. Yeah, I think that that raises something so important, which is the point that there's multiple ways of knowing. What I know as a human being from the experiences I've had, from what I grew up with, my knowledge from other people, from school, what deaf people know from your life experiences and your journey of being in a deaf school, those are all important ways of having knowledge, of knowing. Research is another way of knowing. I should have been more explicit about what I meant by we don't know what the magic is. I mean, from a research perspective, we don't have articles, publications saying statistically with the data, the research says this is the pattern. So our goal is to convert what all of those other ways of knowing, the human ways of knowing things, into a research-based way of knowing. Not because research is the only valid way of knowing, but it is one tool that can be used for advocacy, for when you're in these conversations, to back up what you're already seeing, what you're already saying. So you don't have to wait for us to get caught up on the research side of things, but we're trying to do that. We are trying to use what we can, what we have in this way of doing the science that will support what you do already know and what you're already doing. This is Wyatt. Something that I think, it's an unfortunate reality that the hearing world historically looks at publications. It's not formal until it's in writing with the right jargon and vocabulary to back it up. And that's where I feel like, for me personally, or going on what Naomi was saying, that I feel like we need to bring this to the table to navigate that hearing world, that expectation, that that is what's considered supported, valid by systems in power. And that if we're looking at the local level, how to navigate that, how to encourage and advocate for things, that the path to that needs data. Because the people higher up in positions will say, whether or not it should be that way, that is part of why I shift my focus towards research. I navigated my journey in that direction because I wanted something that would take my work seriously. I wanted my work to be accepted. And so that meant going towards research. And now there's great opportunities for collaboration. So bringing in schools for the deaf so that we can have these people that have the resources and the funding and the supports and money at that level to be able to contribute and encourage the ongoing work. It's just, I think, the way the world works. So it adds more options. Aaron's saying, just to build on that as well, it would be amazing if we could add a research-based response. Yes, this is the magic. This is what it is. I think part of it is the magic of this kind of collaboration. Having researchers who are doing this, who are bringing numbers to support what we already know, that this kind of a collaboration will expand on research that's out there. Naomi's saying, also trying to think about what you want to know. What are the important questions? What do we want to ask of the data? Is there a way to frame the data that's the most helpful? We're making some guesses at that, but the beauty of CEASD and the partnership we have is that these are the important questions. We get to look at, these are the things we want to ask. This is the information we want and need. And that really is what makes collaboration such a rich experience for all of us, because all of the different ways that people are contributing. This is Michelle. There's ways that it's easy to collect information, and that's what we've been using. Map data is easy to get access to analyze. There's a lot of other things that are in a gray area, those fuzzy things that are harder to study related to emotional growth or how important it is to be in a particular school program and what you provide. So we know that there's different opportunities for students in those different settings, but figuring out how to research that. How do we look from a research lens at individual child self-esteem? How does that change when they are in a bilingual language-rich environment? Do we have the ability to use this to get more clarity? Because sometimes the research we want to do is, yes, rich if we can figure out how to capture it, but it's sometimes much more complicated to get at. White saying, this is why we're starting with a low-hanging fruit. This is why we're using what we're using. It's much more available to us. Some point we'll climb the ladder and get to the fruit that's higher up the tree, but this is where we're starting. Also, we want something that shows there's something here, there's something to it that gets more attention so that we can get into the nitty-gritty, go to the more complex things, go to the deep end. My dream, I mean, in a perfect world, would be that I would love to see a longitudinal study over time where we're tracking a large group of kids over their lifetime, but talk about expenses associated with that. We do have to start a little bit at a time, but we'll get there. Chip away at it. Michelle's saying, I agree. Other questions, other comments?
Wow. What a wonderful presentation. Great discussion. I've enjoyed so much listening to what you've had to say. Thank you so much for taking time to present to us. I can see that you care, and I hope to see more collaborations between schools and researchers. I feel that's vital. So thank you all. We'll wait about another minute or so and see if anyone has any other questions. If not, then I can close out the call.
This is Wyatt. We're also happy if you want to be in touch with us afterwards through Twitter or contact us anytime. If you do have more questions or thoughts that come to you later, our door is open. So feel free to be in touch anytime.
Thank you. This is Greg. I know Barbara Raimondo, our executive director, typically sends out the presentation afterwards, so we'll ensure to include your contact information. We will ensure that we include your contact information, excuse interpreter. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon and enjoy your weekend, everyone.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the invitation to be here today.
Thank you.